Most of Canada was glued to Twitter and the TV news channels this weekend as the so-called freedom convoys made news all over the country. And I'm going to talk to Stewart Prest, who's a professor of political science at Simon Fraser University, about that. So welcome to the interview, Stewart.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, I want to talk about the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau invoking the Emergency Act. But before we get there, we really need to talk about what went on this weekend. It was crazy. And I'll just give a brief rundown for our viewers. The Windsor border crossing blockade was cleared by the RCMP. The Coutts, Alberta border crossing, they seized guns. It was like an arsenal, long guns, handguns, body armor. Clearly not a peaceful protest as it's been portrayed. Pacific border crossing blockade near Surrey, BC, big counter protest there. Manitoba border crossing blockade at Emerson, Edmonton convoy, big counter protest there. They got a lot of news. Christian funding site that was used to fund a lot of the convoy that got hacked. So now we know we have the identities. Big Alberta-based oil company, CNRL, was fingered as one of the donors, and then of course we have the Ottawa occupation, which is just doesn't seem to want to end. That's a long laundry list of newsmaking events in 2 or 3 days. What do you make of all that?
I mean, there's a lot going on in many sites, and so what we're seeing here, one of the language, one of the lenses we use in political science to talk about this is effectively we're seeing a cycle of contention underway. So this is an idea that there's a political campaign, a political cause that is drawing attention, and we're seeing a number of different groups, or maybe more or less coordinated, and that's hard to say looking at it from the outside, but all adopting similar repertoires of contentions, the technical names. They're all taking similar tactics to try to achieve some broadly related ends, although there's a fair bit of debate about how much is this really about vaccine mandates, and how much of this is really a broader challenge to elements of political authority in Canada, or to there's an overlay, a patina of white supremacy to much of this, and so there are numerous issues that are clearly mobilizing people as part of this cycle of protest, and so part of this is being fueled by the fact that what has worked in one place, people logically conclude, well, maybe this will work in another. So the fact that the protest, which became an occupation in Ottawa, has lingered for so long, has garnered so much attention, others think, well, perhaps we can innovate, we can adopt a similar approach somewhere else. And so then we see blockades in various cities at various border crossings, and so the longer that these situations continue to linger and metastasize, then we'll see additional actors try to take on those and perhaps innovate around those strategies. And so we see there's the potential for escalation, and at the same time, when authorities are seemingly unable or unwilling to respond to any of these situations in an effective way, other citizens, and we know it's still the majority of Canadians who are opposed to a blanket lifting of sanctions, of vaccine mandates, or let alone some of those other elements that we're discussing. If the state doesn't act, then other citizens will act to respond, and so we're seeing that similar variations on that theme in all kinds of different locations. Innovation, adaptation, emulation, but also opposition. And so we have this cycle of contention where different political forces in society are pushing for their agenda, and the state has not been involved in numerous provinces in a way that would bring it to a resolution. So citizens are taking matters into their own hands.
And by that, I assume you mean counter protests. I mean, I'm seeing that a lot on social media. You're saying people who have been sitting on their hands waiting for the government to act now are saying that's enough. It's pretty clear that the government is not prepared to act, won't act, can't act. And so they're taking to the streets. They're organizing counter protests. Are you surprised this didn't happen earlier?
A little bit, yeah. I think there was a great deal of we'll call it patience on the side of the Ottawa citizens, for instance. I mean, that's the largest protest. We'll focus on there for a second. There is a willingness to wait to let the the police service in Ottawa deal with it. There were cries for staying clear of the area. It was seen to be perhaps not safe, and so there's advisories to avoid the area if you were, say, involved, if you were wearing a mask, if you were doing anything that would perhaps draw attention to oneself. And so I think there was a certain reticence to go into those areas on the part of Ottawans. But of course, when that continues on for 14 days, 17 days, and there's no sign of it ending, and arguably even the opposite, where the space being occupied was being expanded, then citizens at some point are going to be fed up. No one's going to accept a lack of security for an indefinite period of time. And one way to understand this is that a fundamental purpose of the state is to provide security for citizens. And citizens who are feeling threatened for long enough, and they don't see the state responding to restore that security, which is among the rights of the charter. When we talk about charter rights, a right to security of person, when they feel that threatened for long enough, then they're going to push back to try to find a way to reestablish that. And so we see these counter protests all over the country now.
Well, speaking of security and government failing to act, the Prime Minister has been under some pressure to do something. And now he announced, I think just this morning, that he's going to be invoking the Emergency Act. What can you tell us about that?
Well, we see that when there is an issue that is affecting multiple provinces, effectively the federal government has the power to declare a state of emergency, and to do so in consultation with the provinces, but they don't require the invitation from any particular province. And so given that this is a cycle of protest contention that is touching on numerous provinces, and the Ottawa situation alone has affected the Gatineau side of the river, and we can see these different demonstrations in Alberta and BC, there's ample reason to say that this is an issue of national concern, which is the reason for that stipulation in the Emergencies Act. And so the federal government is now going to be empowered to use a broad range of the means at its disposal, including at the extreme the use of military forces to restore order in places in the country where that doesn't exist. It seems like we're going to find out more today, but it seems like the federal government is unwilling to deploy armed forces directly in contact with civilians, and with good reason. And that is a significant escalation, and something we've seen a desire to avoid. But using the ability of the armed forces to move material around, to support efforts to restore order in these places where the state has effectively lost the monopoly on the use of force in areas, we are going to likely see announcements along those lines.
Now, ordinarily, Stewart, politicians make a point of saying, and I mean, government politicians make a point of saying, we don't direct the police. We set the laws, the police enforce the laws. Under the Emergencies Act, does the federal government now have more power to direct the RCMP to, clear out these border blockades, for instance?
Well, they have, in some sense, the relationship has always been there, that the federal government is accountable for the actions of the RCMP. We put in place insulation measures in terms of governance so that politicians are not directly influencing the RCMP, but it has always been the role of the public safety minister, whatever the ministry is called at the time, to ensure that the safety of Canadians is being maintained. So they have authority to direct the overall conduct of intelligence services, of the RCMP, and so on, to just set overall goals. And so that has always been there. So it's a bit of a misunderstanding that politicians will never direct the RCMP. They won't direct them to take specific actions, but they are setting the overall direction for policing and or bodies that are put in place to exercise that oversight over police forces. So most municipal police forces have an advisory board, but the police are accountable to someone for overall direction of the conduct of policing, and so that was always there. Now what we can see is that there is going to be additional resources available to the government to effectively direct a variety of forces to resolve situations. But I don't think you would see them issue a specific directive to the RCMP even now, because there's a desire to avoid direct political interference in policing.
So let's talk about the passage of the Emergency Act. Jagmeet Singh, who is the leader of the federal NDP, has said that he will support the prime minister when the act, or support the government when the act is introduced into Parliament. That essentially gives the minority Liberal government a majority to pass that act. Is that what you would expect to see, that act will be passed, or will it be more contentious and receive a fair amount of opposition in Parliament?
I expect it to be contentious, but I would suspect that the NDP would come in to support the government at the end of the day, and for a couple of reasons. One, I don't think the NDP wants to desert the government and perhaps lead to calls for another election. I don't think the NDP is ready for that. I don't know if anyone is ready for that at this particular moment. That may even persuade the Conservatives to hold off on a vote against if it came to that. They're not in a position to want to demonstrate a lack of support for government on an issue this contentious. But if the NDP is there, then the Conservatives, I wouldn't be surprised if they do oppose it, given the way in which the current leadership is speaking. So I think it will go through, and I think the NDP will support, also because it is going to be on the side of the majority of Canadians who want to see some resolution to this issue. They don't necessarily want to see a militarization. I don't think anyone is overjoyed by that prospect, but there is a real concern here that the security of Canadians is at stake, and so they will want to see action of some kind.
The last question, Stewart, and I've seen a shift in tone about the way experts are talking about the protesters. They're now being referred to by many, at least the ones that I've seen, as domestic terrorists. Is that a fair? I mean, I understand that there's a test for determining who and who isn't a terrorist.
Well, there are a number of different characteristics we look for. So one is a threat, the posing of a threat to citizens. One is the political purpose behind the objective, and one is the attempt or the contemplation of significant damage to life and property, and so on. And so there is a possibility that one could charge some of these groups with domestic terrorism, where all these considerations are in place. But an argument against that is effectively there are all kinds of other things effectively that these groups can already be charged with. That if you are undertaking something that rises to the level of, say, criminal mischief, and the damage to public property, and we see all sorts of instances of that, the flagrant disregard for all kinds of municipal bylaws and provincial traffic safety and so on. So there are all kinds of things that these groups, by staying in place for days and weeks at a time, they're clearly in violation of a variety of different regulations and criminal law. And so, or at least they're clearly allegedly, and then those charges could be brought forward. So while it is possible to charge a number of these groups, essentially the challenge to proving that would be higher, and it's not necessarily the case that the end result in terms of the likelihood of conviction or the penalties that would accrue would be any more significant. We've seen the Ontario government, for instance, introduce regulations that can be applied to protesters. And so while the definition may fit in some of these instances, it's not clear that we even need to go there. The difference between protest and occupation is pretty clear. Canadians are free to assemble, free to protest, but where there is this ongoing disregard for the safety of other Canadians, for the respect for order in cities, and such that the functioning of the country is imperiled, then I think it's pretty clear that there are a variety of different criminal charges that can be brought.
Now, I understand the legal approach to that, or the legalistic approach to this, the definition of domestic terrorism. Do they meet the definition, don't they? But it seems to me that a lot of this is political. I mean, if you frame the protests as, you frame the freedom convoys as protests, that's one, you're looking at it through one lens. And if you frame it as domestic terrorism, that's a completely different lens, and it moves people in different ways. And so it strikes me as a big shift in the political narrative around this to call them domestic terrorists.
It certainly would, and it's one that would have unpredictable results, I think. And I think that's one of the reasons why politicians may be a little careful about going down that road, because effectively there's the protests that are occurring on the street, occupations that are occurring on the street, and then there's the broad public perception of what's actually happening. And I think it's useful to distinguish between the two of them. And it is clear that a party like the Conservative Party is clearly trying to lean into the grievance, the frustration with the current situation that many who, when asked about, do you support some of the goals of the protesters, Canadians, something on the order of 30%, depends on the poll you're looking at, say, yes, I have some affinity with what's going on. And so there's an awareness there that a lot of Canadians are really frustrated with where things are, and this is a vehicle for that frustration. And while what is happening on the ground is destructive and problematic in all sorts of ways for the people in the immediate vicinity, for those who depend on movement through the borders and so on, to go down that road of labeling it as domestic terrorism is in a form another kind of escalation, and one that would be freshly alienating for those Canadians who identify with those larger goals, even if they're not fully aware of what is actually happening in these sites. And so I think there's a desire, in a sense, if you want to talk about national unity, I don't think people are going to see eye to eye on this issue anytime soon, but an awareness that there's frustration, there's a debate there, and a desire to avoid creating and essentially putting additional fuel on this already significant fire by that kind of labeling. And whether that's the right decision or not is too going to be a political question. We'll see how people respond, but I suspect that's part of the calculation behind it.
Stewart, always appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for this.
My pleasure, anytime.